Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Sunday, August the 13th, 2023. Today I want to give an update on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. I've talked about his horoscope quite a lot before, and in this update I'm not always going to be completely new and original. I will be covering some old ground, but this update is to a great extent about what I'm seeing right now in August and perhaps what might be going on over the next few months for him. It's also an update in terms of my understanding of his horoscope. I have looked quite a lot at his horoscope, and when I look at his horoscope, I notice new things, new connections, and that's also something I want to talk about. So anyway, let's look at Volodymyr Zelensky's horoscope. So there is Volodymyr Zelensky, and here is his chart. Now, recently, in fact, yesterday, I was talking about the Sun-Venus conjunctions, and Volodymyr Zelensky has a Sun-Venus conjunction, and I was kind of thinking, what does it mean to have a Sun-Venus conjunction? Venus is the planet of relating. Venus is about, how we get on with other people. His Sun-Venus conjunction, is I think it actually could be problematic, in spite of an apparent advantage. The Sun is who Volodymyr Zelensky is. He is an Aquarius. He has got the Venus conjunct his Sun, and perhaps this really helped him in his political career. The way he presented himself, as an Aquarian, being very different, being his own man, having a comedian as president must have seemed at the time, a great departure from the past, a way of breaking free from, the corruption and politics of the past. And that Sun conjunct Venus means that he could express not just his identity, but his charisma. Venus comes together with the Sun. He can show voters in Ukraine who he is, and because Venus is a planet of relating, he can relate to the voters. He can present his personality in a way that is very relatable. So that's one aspect of Sun-Venus conjunction. But there is a downside to having a Sun-Venus conjunction. Venus is combust. The principle of relating is too close to the Sun. The Sun kind of burns it up. And I'm thinking there may be a certain detachment there. And this is an air sign. If you don't remember, there's no planets in water in his horoscope except for Uranus in Scorpio, which is a generational planet. And so if you've got no planets in water and you've got a Sun-Venus conjunction, there may be a detachment from other people, and in particular, the feelings and emotions of the people in Ukraine. He may seem to be the spirit of Ukraine. And in some ways he is. He's the Ukrainian president. He kind of symbolizes the country. You could argue that Zelensky's chart is the Ukrainian chart, because if you take a sort of medieval view of leadership, the king is the country is the king. But yeah, I think that, there is a detachment, and maybe it's okay to be detached when things are going okay, but when things are not going okay, the question is, can he really empathize with what ordinary Ukrainians are doing? And, he perhaps goes through the motions, with his T-shirt and all that kind of stuff, and never wearing a suit. And so that's his idea. And remember, he's got a lot of planets in fixed signs. He's got, the fixed signs in astrology, by the way, are Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. And so he's got Sun and Venus in Aquarius. He's got Mars, Moon, Saturn, and Mars, Moon, Saturn in Leo. So 5 of the 7 traditional planets are in fixed signs. So once he's decided on a particular approach that seems to work, he will stick with it. And if that approach suddenly stops working, he may continue to stick with it. And I think that might be a bit of a problem there. So there's a certain lack of adaptability in this chart, which is, when I was first writing about Ukraine and, how is it going to work in terms of a war, this fixity. I mean, I suppose in one sense it's great to begin with. If you're fighting a war, you just keep going, you keep fighting. But the lack of flexibility may mean that the structure doesn't bend, that in the end it just breaks. So that's perhaps part of the problem. And I am concerned that there's a lack of empathy here. In terms of him and the rest of what Ukraine is going on. I know maybe you take a different view, but I'm not convinced. And, with that lack of water, a phrase that has become quite common, I've noticed in the last year or two, is not being able to read the room. And I am thinking that maybe that is a problem that Volodymyr Zelensky has, that he can't read the room. I was looking at the pictures of him at the NATO summit in Vilnius, and he just looked quite sort of isolated, as if he didn't quite know how to respond. Perhaps the situation had changed. He couldn't quite work out what was going on. And reading the room is not just about reading reading the Ukrainian people. It's about reading, the sort of the changes politically going on in Ukraine. It's really complicated as far as I understand it. You've got power struggles. They might be swept under the carpet, but they're going on. And maybe he's not kind of fully aware of what's going on. Maybe he's not even reading the room in terms of the international situation. I think this is a problem he has through his lack of water. And I want to compare his chart with someone else who didn't have any water in his chart. It's a chart I've looked at before. It's a chart I've compared with Zelensky before, but it's a chart that lots of commentators have compared Zelensky against. So let me just show you this chart. I want to compare him again. I've done this before with Ngo Diem. He was the South Vietnamese leader. He was born in 1901. He stood up against the communists during the Vietnam War. In 1961, Lyndon B. Johnson, when he was vice president, said of Ngo Diem that he was, I think, the Churchill of Asia. And I think that Zelensky has been compared with Churchill as well. And Ngo Diem, in the end, in 1960, late end of 1963, was killed. I don't know whether he was assassinated or murdered or executed, and he not by communists, by his own people. And Ngo Diem did not have any water in his horoscope, like Zelensky. So Pisces, Scorpio, Cancer, these signs are empty. And I'm suspecting that Ngo Diem was not able to read the room. And so I just want to compare the two charts side by side. So if we do a bi-wheel of Ngo Diem and Volodymyr well, in this case, I've got Zelensky is in the outer wheel, and Nagodin Diem is in the central wheel. We don't actually have any time of birth. I don't have a time of birth for Nagodin Diem. And what's interesting is that Nagodin Diem, he had an exact Jupiter-Neptune opposition. So Nagodin Diem had Jupiter in Sagittarius and Neptune in Gemini. And by contrast, Zelensky had Jupiter in Gemini and Neptune in Sagittarius. So they actually both had Jupiter-Neptune oppositions. Nagodin Diem's opposition was much closer. So the Jupiter-Neptune principle might be about having hopes. Jupiter is a very optimistic planet, but Neptune is about a fantasy. And so Jupiter-Neptune, is about having a fantasy about, the way things are and believing this fantasy. And this fantasy, in the end, it turns out to be it turns out to be fantasy. They both these men had it. And going back to Zelensky's chart, there's his Jupiter and his Jupiter opposition Neptune. Now it might seem a bit wide, Jupiter opposition Neptune, but it's very much configured with the ascendant. Jupiter is right here, 6 degrees from the ascendant. Neptune is 4 degrees from the ascendant. So the fact that it is so linked up with the ascendant makes me think that it is important. And it's also, he's got ascendant and the ascendant on the Jupiter-Neptune midpoint. So although Zelensky's Jupiter-Neptune opposition is much wider than Nagodin Diem's opposition with Neptune, I think the fact that the ascendant is involved means that both men are really having this Jupiter-Neptune and sort of having a sort of a fantasy about what can be achieved. Also a fantasy perhaps about what is going on internally, politically, not really getting it because both men don't have any water in their chart. Another small comparison, which I'm not sure I can make, but I'll give it a go. One of the reasons that Nagodin Diem fell in Vietnam was because of this conflict between Christianity and Buddhism, specifically Catholicism and Buddhism. I don't know if you remember that image, 1963, I think it was 1963, of this Buddhist monk burning himself up in Vietnam. It was really sort of iconic image of this monk covered in flame. And so the Buddhists in South Vietnam felt they were being persecuted. Maybe we've got a bit of a sense of that in Ukraine, when there is certainly evidence that, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is being potentially persecuted in Ukraine. So there may be another comparison there between Ukraine and South Vietnam. So as I've said before, Zelensky has to be very aware of what happened to Nagodin Diem. If Zelensky is killed, he won't be killed by the Russians. I don't think. I'm not saying it's astrologically. I think everyone knows this. He'll be killed by his fellow Ukrainians. I think that's very likely, given what's happened. What happened to Nagodin? Personally, I don't. Somehow I've got this feeling Zelensky will get out. But that's just my feeling. But as far as what is going on at the moment, so let's look at the transits at the moment. What's going on here? So we'll just look at his chart with relationship to what's happening today. At the moment, Mercury Mercury is about to go retrograde. It goes retrograde at about 21 Virgo. So Mercury goes retrograde, square his ascendant, and so he's got his ascendant. His ascendant is on Jupiter Neptune midpoint. It's on his Mercury Saturn midpoint. I think with Mercury going direct on his Mercury Saturn midpoint, I think that there's a certain sense of him feeling down. I think reality is starting to make itself felt for Zelensky, because you can see there's his Jupiter Neptune, there's the midpoint here, and so you've got Mercury coming up here. Mars is already on right now. Mars is squaring his ascendant. So for Zelensky, there's a lot of sort of mental agitation going on here. And I think perhaps reality is starting to make itself felt for him. So another chart I wanted to look at was his. This is a chart which is his. How shall I put it? It's his demi-return. It's the point where the sun. He was born end of January. That's his birthday. This is the point where the sun is halfway. It's halfway between one birthday and another birthday. So what you can do is you can set up a chart for this, and so this is his demi return. So on July the 28th, he was exactly 6 months from his birthday. So what do we see here? There is some good stuff going on in this chart. I mean, I've been very negative about his transits, but there is some good stuff here. You can see that he has an exact sun trine moon in this demi return. That might be useful. I mean, it's not just about his relationship to his country. It's about his relationship to other people, people at large. He may be able to make some new friends. There's a certain sense of confidence here. The sun and the moon are the male female planets. They're in a trine aspect. That is good, but the moon is a problem in other respects. So you'll see that in this chart he's got Mars is at 11 Virgo and Saturn is at 556 Pisces. So Mars is separating from Saturn. So that might seem good. But then that moon at 546 Sagittarius is exactly square his Saturn. So that puts a damper, I think, on the whole thing. Without that square, I think one could have been quite optimistic because of the moon trine the sun. But this trine between, the moon trine to the sun is separating. It's past its peak, and it's now moving on to the square of Saturn. So I think you kind of get the feeling of moving from the good to the bad, and the moon will eventually hit the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So I actually don't think that that solar return is that demi-solar return is particularly positive. Though you could say Mercury-Venus conjunction in Libra, in Leo, close to Regulus in the 10th house. And you've also got his sun in Leo in the 10th house, really strong 10th house. He's still able to keep himself publicly relevant. Mercury Venus is great in terms of communicating, making the absolute most of what he's got in terms of communicating about Ukraine's strengths. Now, this demi return, I'm not even 100% sure that the demi returns actually work. I think, or at least that they work to the extent of the solar return. They're certainly not as strong as the solar return, but I was just showing you this to just demonstrate that you can create a solar return for the half year, for your sort of your half birthday. Another return chart, which is a much more short-term chart, this demi-solar return should in theory last for 6 months. Then you've got his lunar return. So this lunar return is set for August the 16th. So as far as what is dramatic about it, well, the only thing to be said is that Saturn in Pisces is on the midheaven. This does say something about the next month. So Saturn on the midheaven, maybe his leadership feels as if it's a bit of a grind. It's not so comfortable. I don't think he looks happy as being. He doesn't look like a happy president with Saturn on the midheaven in his lunar return. But this lunar return, it doesn't last too long. By the next lunar return, he will have moved on to something else. Finally, I want to consider his solar arc directions. Now, remember, solar arc directions is when you move a whole chart 1 degree for every year. So so in other words, if you want to know what's going to happen when someone is 45, you move pretty much everything in the chart 45 degrees, and that will supposedly tell you something about it. So let's see if there's anything interesting going on. So there is Zelensky's chart in the middle, and on the outer wheel are the solar arc directions. And I've talked about his Sun-Venus conjunction at the beginning of this video. And so solar arc directed, his Sun-Venus conjunction will have directed around 45 degrees. So that Sun-Venus here at birth has now moved on to around 21 Pisces. And you will see that he has his ascendant at 2147 Gemini. So this Sun-Venus conjunction is directing to his square, to the square of his ascendant. And remember what I said. Very soon Mercury goes retrograde at 21 Virgo. So that Mercury going retrograde at 21 Virgo in a few days' time, or is it a week's time? Very soon. That square his ascendant, and that picks up on his solar arc direction to the square of his ascendant. And remember, his ascendant is on his Jupiter-Neptune midpoint, and it's on his Mercury-Saturn midpoint. So, I'm thinking, with this Sun and Venus hitting his Mercury-Saturn midpoint and Jupiter-Neptune midpoint, it's this interplay of being very concerned about the future, being very negative Mercury, which is Mercury-Saturn, and then Jupiter-Neptune is this sort of optimism, this sort of hope coming from nowhere. And so these two midpoints, Jupiter, Neptune, Mercury, Saturn, are very important for Zelensky at the moment. He probably keeps alternating between the two. One moment being really optimistic about what can happen to Ukraine, and the next moment being down in the dumps. And another direction which is really pretty close at the moment is, notice Saturn. His Saturn is at 1445. 1445. His directed Saturn is 1445 Libra. So you see, you can see there's his Saturn. See there, he was born with Saturn at 2849 Leo. So you click it forward around 45 degrees and it gets to 1445 Libra. And his Mercury is at 1456 Capricorn. So what's happening now is that his directed Saturn is starting to really hit his Mercury. And so Saturn hitting Mercury, what does that mean? Well, it means having a pretty negative view about the future. So I think there's a sense, I suspect, astrologically, that he's beginning to realize that it's not working to plan. Is it despair? Possibly. But that Saturn square Mercury is really difficult, and the thing is, it chimes with everything else going on in the chart. So overall, one other thing I should make before I close this video is the fact that Uranus is a position of transiting Uranus. That's something I didn't look at. So you'll notice that in today's, looking at the horoscope for Monday, August the 14th, you'll see that Uranus is at 2259 Taurus. And very soon it's going to go retrograde. And it's going to go back 2120 Taurus. And so you'll see that Zelensky's midheaven is 2021 Aquarius. So what that means is that Uranus is going to go back and make a square to his midheaven. Midheaven is about his leadership, his rule. Having Uranus square his midheaven, there are challenges there that he certainly needs to be aware of. Oh, and one final thing I almost forgot. August the 16th, there's a new moon, which is at 2317 Leo. So it's here, 2317 Leo. So it's exactly on his Moon-Saturn midpoint. New moon on the Moon-Saturn midpoint. This is more themes about more and more. The theme of depression and despair is coming up again and again in Zelensky's chart because he's got the new moon on the Moon-Saturn midpoint. So that's all I'm going to say about Zelensky. I think the advice to him is absolutely obvious, and I've said this before. I think a lot of people have said this before, that given what's going on, Zelensky needs to look at what happened to Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam. There are astrological parallels between Zelensky and Ngo Dinh Diem. They both don't have any water. They both perhaps can't quite see what's going on around them. They both have this Jupiter-Neptune sort of optimism that things really can turn out fine. They both had that. Ngo Dinh Diem was killed only 2 years after Johnson said that he was a Churchill of Asia. So as usual, I would advise Zelensky to get out. And that's not even about whether or not Ukraine wins the war, because the Vietnam War ended in 1975. 1963 was a very early stage in the Vietnam War, but still Ngo Dinh Diem was killed by his fellow anti-communists. So all those sort of power struggles going on, which I'm sure are going on in Ukraine, just with Zelensky, with that lack of water, I just don't. He probably just doesn't see it all. That's what I reckon. So yeah, he should just leave. I mean, he's a rich man. He can just go and have a nice life somewhere else. So that's my opinion. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I will talk to you very soon.